Psychoanalytic theory is the theory that is proposed by Sigmund Freud. Freud is probably one of the most well-known names in all of psychology, and to be honest, he's also probably one of the most controversial names in all of psychology. To begin, Freud was a medical doctor. As the textbook discusses, at the time of Sigmund Freud's work, there really wasn't a formal field of psychology. But nevertheless, he's still seen as one of the fathers of psychology because of how influential his theory on the mind really was. So let's get into it a little bit. The first, probably most important concept of Sigmund Freud's theory is the idea that our mind is made up of a conscious and unconscious component. In fact, he argued that the majority of our mental capacity is unconscious, that we are unaware of what drives our personality. So let's get into that a little bit more. He argues that our mind is comprised of three structures. These are hypothetical structures. The id, the ego, and the superego do not actually exist in terms of actual structures in the brain, but he was hypothesizing that there is this dynamic interaction of thought processes in our mind. And so here we go. So first and foremost, you have the id. The id is all about our basic drives. And importantly, it's the part of us that wants pleasure. It's the part of us that wants immediate gratification. We want to avoid pain. We want to feel good all the time. I want now, now, now. Me, me, me. Everything I want. I want to feel good. Who cares about tomorrow? So he called it the pleasure principle. So as an example, imagine you're grocery shopping. The id is the part of you that just wants to buy candy because candy tastes delicious, and who cares if it's bad for my health? I want it because it tastes good. Obviously, though, we are aware that if I eat candy every single day, all day, every day, that's not going to be very good for me, and I'll probably get sick, and I'm not going to be living a very long life. So, on the other hand, there's the superego. The superego, which Freud referred to as the morality principle, this is the part of us that considers the long-term consequences of our actions. This is the part of us that also considers what other people think about us. So, for example, the superego tells me, I should probably eat some vegetables. It's also, though, the part of me that thinks about how I'm going to be coming across to other people. So, as an example, imagine you are at the grocery store and you're checking out, you're paying for your food. As you put your grocery items on the conveyor belt, the superego might be the part of us that maybe kind of hides the candy under the vegetables. That way the people around us maybe think that they only see vegetables, the candy is being hidden. So to other people, we come off as a very healthy individual. One analogy that I've heard is that the id is kind of like the devil on your shoulder, saying, buy the candy, buy the candy. And the superego is kind of like the angel on your shoulder saying, buy the vegetables. The ego is the reality principle. The ego is the mediator. The ego is the part of our mind that balances the id and the superego in realistic ways. So for example, maybe the ego is the part of you that says, hey, I've been working out a lot recently. I've been exercising. I think it's okay if I buy a little candy. Or maybe the ego is the part of you that says, I haven't been working out very much lately. I've been kind of eating unhealthily. Maybe I should buy some vegetables. So the ego is all about trying to satisfy our id wishes, but in a way that makes the superego content as well. So, Sigmund Freud has this quote that always stuck with me. He says that anxiety is the price we pay for living in a civilization. And I think there's something very interesting about that quote. So if we think about other animals, other animals don't really care about how they are perceived by other individuals. They're not really self-conscious beings. But humans, we very much care about what other people think of us. Take a look at social media, for example. Instagram and Facebook, these platforms really thrive off of image and self-presentation. So there's a large component to the id, ego, superego in our everyday lives. The ego's job is to mediate the relationship between the id and the ego in a realistic manner. But as Sigmund Freud emphasizes, that is not always possible. We often experience anxiety when we can't have what we want, or when we can't satisfy our basic impulses in desirable ways. So this is where we talk about ego defense mechanisms. According to Freud, we have a self-serving bias. We want to look at ourselves in a positive way. We want to feel like we are good people, even when we do bad things. And so if I can't satisfy my basic pleasure principle in a realistic manner, or if I believe that facing reality would be too difficult, it'd be too painful, I often have to resort to defense mechanisms. Basically, it's all about self-preservation. And so here is a list of some sample ego defense mechanisms. The textbook also covers a handful as well. You can see a list on Wikipedia. There's a number of defense mechanisms, and you certainly do not need to memorize all of them, but you should understand the basic concept, which is that at a subconscious level, we might engage in thoughts or behaviors that ultimately are geared towards protecting our ego. But it's unconscious. We're not doing this necessarily in a way that we are aware of. So, for example, let's look at displacement. Imagine that you have really strong negative feelings towards your boss. Unfortunately, you can't always express those negative feelings towards your boss because there might be, consequences that are, negative. Like, for example, you could get fired from your job. So, as a result, you might displace those feelings towards a different object. For example, maybe not you, but think of an example where somebody might abuse their dog. So they have a really rough day at work, and as a result, they come home and they kick their dog. Now, they're not doing this, in a conscious manner. They're not thinking, I'm hurting my dog because of what's going on at work. Ultimately, they think that there's some, rational reason. Like they might say, oh, my dog is misbehaving again, and so therefore it deserves to be kicked. But ultimately, maybe there's something deeper going on. Maybe the person is expressing their frustrations at work in an unhealthy manner by ultimately, hurting their animals. So, sorry to use a negative example, but the idea is that when we can't express our true selves, ultimately we go through these defense mechanisms that allow us to satisfy the id, ego, superego dynamic in a way that reduces our anxiety. So it allows me to not think about the stress of work, if you will. Maybe let's look at one more example, projection. Projection would be the idea that when I have negative feelings towards myself in some way, rather than face that truth, because that would be too difficult to ultimately acknowledge, instead, I might point out that weakness in other people. So, for example, maybe I'm really self-conscious about the way that I look, but I don't want to acknowledge that, because if I feel that I don't look the way I want to look, that's going to give me anxiety. And so as a result, I might walk around, pointing out how everybody else looks, a certain way that is, unattractive. Ultimately, I'm taking my feelings about myself at a subconscious level and projecting that onto other people. This reminds me of the movie Mean Girls, which, if you haven't seen that movie, it's about these popular kids in school who ultimately have their own self-conscious issues, but they project those issues onto other people. All right, let's cover one final aspect of this theory, and this is where things get weird, at least in my opinion. If you haven't already thought that this theory is a little bizarre, you probably will start to believe that's the case now. And what I'm referring to is Freud's psychosexual stages of development. As a developmental psychologist, one of the things I really appreciate is that Freud offers one of the first formal theories of human development. It's not necessarily used all that much today because there are some major criticisms. However, it is important to note that he was, really doing his best to try and explain why is it that, for example, children and adults think and behave in quite different ways. So, first and foremost, as Freud's theory, as mentioned already, Freud's theory was extremely controversial, and that is because he emphasized the role of sexuality very strongly in his theory. But he wasn't talking about sex in terms of sexual intercourse necessarily, although that is an important component. But ultimately, he's talking about sex in terms of just basic instinct. Ultimately, we are animals, and so life is sexually transmitted. We are here because of sex. So to Freud, everything we do could somehow be influenced by human sexuality. So let's get into it. The first important concept is the notion of libido. Libido, according to Freud, is sexual energy. Think of it as like a life force coursing through us. There is no actual libido within us. Again, just like the structures of the mind, this is a hypothetical idea. But his notion is that there is this energy within us, and it focuses on different parts of the body at different parts of life, or what Freud called different erogenous zones. So importantly, it focuses on different parts of the body at different stages of life, depending on what is important for survival or growth and development at different parts of life. All right, so it all begins with stage 1, the oral stage, ages 0 to 18 months. So let's think about what humans are like during that first year and a half. Well, ultimately, we don't do much besides sleeping and eating at a basic level. So what Freud argued is that the libido is focused on the mouth. In other words, children derive pleasure from oral activities. And so what are some common examples? Well, breastfeeding, sucking their thumb. Arguably, there's not much else to life in terms of personality, human thought and behavior when it comes to infants and toddlers. So he believed that since infants are pretty much just interested in oral activities, the libido must be focused on the mouth during that stage. And then, once we become a little more independent, the libido focuses on other parts of the body. So specifically, think about 18 months to 36 months, the toddler years. One of the important milestones that Freud emphasized was toilet training. So kids learn potty training, and that's an important element of becoming more independent. So whereas in the first stage, in the newborn infancy stage, we just go to the bathroom in our diaper. Whenever we feel like it, we just go to the bathroom. We don't have to really consider the long-term consequences, if you will. But on the other hand, in order to be a productive member of our society, we can't just go to the bathroom whenever we feel like it. As adults, what we do, of course, is we regulate our bowels. We wait to go to the bathroom until we can go into the restroom, into the facilities where it's more appropriate for our society. if I were to go to the bathroom, in the middle of the street like the other animals, that would make me have anxiety because other people would judge me negatively for that. So ultimately, I have to learn some independence. In other words, Freud focuses on toilet training during the second stage, and it's known as the anal stage. Ultimately, Freud believed that during this period, children derive pleasure from controlling their bowels. But again, the whole point of his psychosexual stages is that we go through different stages of development for survival. So it's important that during this period of life, we develop a little bit of self-sufficiency. The third stage, known as the phallic stage, according to Freud, is where boys and girls become aware of their sex. In other words, boys become aware that they are male and that they have a penis, and girls become aware that they are female and that they have a vagina. And importantly, boys and girls learn that there is a difference between boys and girls. So one of the interesting components to consider here is that Freud believed children develop a strong sexual attraction towards their opposite sex parent. So the Oedipus complex is where boys develop a strong attraction towards their mothers, and in fact a competitive hatred towards their fathers. And the opposite is true, according to Freud, of the Electra complex, where girls develop an attraction towards their fathers and a hatred towards their mothers. Now, there's really not a lot of strong evidence to support this theory, but what Freud was getting at is the concept that children become aware that boys and girls are different, that boys and girls seem to be pairing together for reproductive purposes, and thus they start to look at the important figures in their life to draw upon those meaningful relationships. So boys, they say, well, if I'm a boy and boys and girls pair together, I'm going to look towards my mother because she's the most important female in my life. And my father, he's the competition. So again, ultimately, today, psychologists do not find a lot of evidence for this component, but it is an important consideration that boys and girls do become aware of differences in sex at this time. In fact, I had a student in a previous class tell me that it was when her children got to this age period where she felt it was no longer as appropriate for her and her husband to be naked around the children because they started to become more curious of, different body parts, for example. All right, 2 more stages. Stage 4 is the latency stage. And this is where the libido kind of rests. It becomes dormant. And the reason for this is that Freud believed children need to develop social skills. And if the libido was running wild through our body, that would detract us from developing, important lessons on how to interact with other people. So around age 6, this is when children start to go to school. And so we develop basic social skills at that time. And the libido kind of takes a back seat until we hit puberty. And this is the final stage, known as the genital stage. It's also the only time where libido is actually focused on the genitals for reproductive purposes. So this is where we're actually talking about sex in terms of, sexual intercourse. All right, so let's bring this full circle by discussing the idea of a fixation. A fixation basically means when our personality is affected in a way that we get stuck in one of the psychosexual stages at a subconscious level. So Freud used the example of biting your fingernails. Another example he used was smoking. He argued that these were related to the oral stage. In other words, imagine somebody experiences trauma in the first year of life. maybe they experienced abuse or neglect, and that this would affect the way that their brain develops over time, so that as an adult, they deal with their anxiety through an oral fixation. Sigmund Freud was actually an avid cigar smoker, and so I wonder if he was drawing upon his own experiences. But ultimately, there's actually not a lot of evidence to support that part of the theory. But the idea is that our personality is driven by unconscious influence. And again, it gets back to the ultimate concept here, which is there's a dynamic relationship between the conscious and subconscious parts of our mind. That maybe the reason I bite my fingernails is because of, unbeknownst to myself, some early experience that I had that ultimately affected my personality. The concept here is that our personality is driven by conscious and unconscious influence. And I think that personally makes a lot of sense. But the major criticism that we have to consider with this theory is that it's not testable. You can't necessarily prove that my personality is driven by something in my unconscious, because the very nature of the unconscious is that you can't measure it. It's subconscious. And so although this theory is quite influential, it still very much permeates psychological theory. It's not necessarily seen as reliable and valid because of the abstract nature of the unconscious.